This episode is brought to you by the Davenant Institute's educational arm, Davenant Hall. Interested in dipping your toes at Davenant Hall this upcoming Trinity term from April 8th to June 15th? Registration closes March 29th. Here's a taste at the courses. 1st and 2nd Corinthians with Joshua Shaw, The Mercy of God in Scripture and Tradition with Ryan Hurd, Male and Female in Modernity with Alistair Roberts, Introduction to Syriac and Arabic Theology with Charles Carman, Philosophy as a Way of Life with Joe Minich, Aristotle Seminar 1, Ethics and Metaphysics with Tim Jacobs, Early Christian Worship, Ritual and Space in the Ancient Church with Matthew Hoskin, Reformation of the Modern World with Michael Lynch, Christian Epic and Old English Literature with Anthony Cirilla, Moral Theology for Counseling with Jim Pachta, Anglican Polity with Nathaniel Keene, Reformed Polity with our very own Daniel Hyde, Baptist Polity with Garrett Walden and Jake Stone, and Philosophy of Law with Colin Redeemer. GGG listeners who are first-time Davenant Hall students get a $25 discount on auditing any of their Trinity term courses from April 8th to June 15th. Registration closes March 29th with code GGG Trinity 24, which is in our show notes. Go to www.davenanthall.com to sign up. Hey, this is Peter Bell, and I am in the beautiful wine country of Central Coast, California, in Santa Maria, north end of Santa Maria, in Santa Barbara County. I serve Redeemer OPC, Redeemer Orthodox Presbyterian Church, on the north end of Santa Maria. We meet at Temple Bethel, which is right there, Temple Bethel, at 11 a.m. for Sunday service and 9:45 a.m., so just before that, for Sunday school for all ages. We have kids Sunday school, adult Sunday school, or all Sunday school at 9:45. You can find us at discoverredeemer.org with one R. Again, discoverredeemer.org. We have a bunch of activities throughout the week, but most importantly, Sunday we have the gospel preached, the sacraments administered, and church discipline faithfully brought out. So I hope to see you here at Redeemer OPC in Santa Maria, Central Coast, wine country of Santa Barbara. Hope to see you.
Hey everybody, this is Pastor Danny Hyde from the Oceanside United Reformed Church. I want to invite you out to our church. We meet in sunny Southern California, here in San Diego, and we meet at the Army Navy Academy in Carlsbad, right along the ocean, as you can see, the Pacific. And we meet every Sunday at 10 o'clock in the morning. We hear the Word of God, we hear the gospel preached. We have the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning, and then we have Sunday school at about noon for kids. We come again together at 5 o'clock every night, Sunday night, for teaching, prayer, and singing. And then we also have various midweek groups, Bible studies, men's, women's, and also other Bible studies as well throughout the week. So I want to invite you out to worship with us. If you know anybody in the area here in North County of San Diego, invite them as well, let them know. You can find out more about us on our website, oceansideurc.org, or also on all those various social media. You'll find us as well. God bless.
Hello, welcome to the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast. We bridge the gap to reform Christian theology. And as my esteemed co-host, Nick Fullweiler, who's not here today, likes to say, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. And as you all know, or if you're new, you get to learn right now, this is our book club episodes. Every Thursday, we have a book club episode with one of the various publishers that we work with and their authors, either repeat guests who come on or new guests, like today's new guest. It's Prasanta Verma, and she is coming to us to talk about her book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness, The Pain of Marginalization and the Path to Belonging, which is published by IVP. We've had a bunch of IVP books on our show before, and we were very excited to talk about this book with Prasanta on the show as well. So some show notes, you'll find a link to this book in our show notes. So click on whatever podcasting app that you're on, go to the show notes, click this book, buy one for yourself, buy one for your friend, your pastor, book group, whatever it is. I highly, highly encourage those. Every book, and especially this one, because Prasanta is a poet too, and she writes really pleasingly. It's a really good read, but also really good content as well. So I very much encourage people to pick this up for themselves or for their friends. And also beyond this too, you'll find information on our show. Our website is guiltgracepod.com. You can find our new shop, which is there too. our confessionalpods.com, which is a network that we started with a few other confessional podcasts that kind of span the Reformed and Presbyterian and Baptist and other confessional denominational landscapes. If you want to hear from that too, confessionalpods.com. We're also a 501c3 nonprofit. So we want to make sure we let you guys know about that too. Any donations that you guys donate to us is tax deductible at the end of the year. And so we can give you documentation for that as well. We have our shop, so you can buy some merchandise from that too. And also our NAPARC's North American Presbyterian Reformed Council, NAPARC, which is kind of the umbrella of about 10 Reformed and Presbyterian denominations. There's a zip code on there. So if you type in your zip code, you can find the closest church near you. Because our number one thing is we want to drive people to the church on this show to hear good doctrine each and every week. And maybe you'll hear something that is similar to what you hear on our show as well, and our YouTube. So all of these conversations, if you're not a big audio person, I'm actually a little bit more of a YouTube person myself, which has been changing a little bit more over the last few weeks and months. But these are automatically uploaded to our YouTube channel. So Guilt Grace Podcast or Guilt Grace Gratitude Podcast, and you can find our YouTube. But I think that's enough of all of our show notes. It's my pleasure to introduce to our audience Prasanta Verma. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. Thank you for waiting for 3 minutes for me to get through all the show notes so we can start the conversation. So let's let our audience get to know Prasanta Verma. If they haven't heard you before, maybe they haven't seen your Substack, which has got a few thousand subscribers, which is awesome. So let our audience get to know Prasanta Verma beyond her IVP bio. Who's Prasanta?
Well, that's a great question. So, Prasanta, I'm a writer and a poet, as you also mentioned. I was actually I was born in India, and I grew up in the United States. I grew up in the rural South in
Mm-hmm.
Alabama. So, I'm part sort of Southern, but I've also spent a good bit of my life in the Midwest. So I'm
Oh,
also
that's right. Yep.
So I kind of have both identities in my background, and I claim both of them. And I love to take walks, to be outside in nature,
Mm-hmm.
and I love to take pictures when I'm outside. So I'm very much an amateur photographer.
I've seen your pictures. Yep.
Oh, you have. And so I think one surprising thing about me that maybe a lot of people don't know is that I used to dabble in theater. And
Huh.
so I was in college, and as an adult, I did some theater, so community theater and then theater in college. So yeah, fun times.
Heck yeah. And according to your bio too, you've got your master's in public health and your master's in business administration, which I think sometimes might seem like two opposing things, but why'd you get those degrees and how do you use them? What was the thought behind those?
Yeah, so, well, I got my master's in public health first because I was actually at once upon a time considering a career in medicine.
Huh.
So while I was contemplating that vocation, I was getting my master's in public health. And at that time, it was a newer field, and I was really interested in learning, and I felt like it would be a good complement to my future in medicine. I ended up not going in medicine. And then I also wanted to work. I was started to work at a hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to learn more of the business side of things. And so that's what led to my business degree.
Heck yeah. And you're also into poetry too. So talk to your essays and poetry because you've written for Sojourners, Propel Women, Barren Magazine, Indianapolis Review, a bunch of different stuff. So talk to our listeners a little bit about your poetic pursuits.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for asking about that. So I've been a writer all my life, pretty much since I was about 7, I
Okay.
think, was when I wrote my first poem.
Huh.
And I kind of joke that
Do you
maybe I
still
was.
have that first poem?
I do, I do. It's very
Heck yeah.
embarrassing.
I like it. Yeah. Yep.
It's very, very embarrassing. So it's like, birthdays are fun. Presents weigh a ton. That's the kind of
I
poem.
like it. Yeah. You still rhyme.
That's how
That's
it
good.
started.
Yep.
So I think I was writing poems before I could barely even write much else, which is weird. But I think I've just always had an affinity for poetry. And then when I was in high school, actually, I had a teacher reach out to me, and she approached me one day and she said, "Would you like to write for our school's literary magazine?"
Hmm.
And I have to admit, I didn't know what the school's literary magazine was. I
Sure.
didn't even
Yeah.
know what a literary magazine was. I didn't even know our school had one.
Uh-huh.
Well, but I said to her, she told me people write poems and essays, they submit art. And when she said that to me, I immediately said yes. Because for some reason, something just spoke to me at
Huh.
that moment when she said that to me. And I have to give her credit for making that come alive in me because
Hmm.
she called it out and she asked me in it. And I think that started my journey.
Yeah, no, that's great because I mean, I'll talk about this during the interview too, but each and every chapter ends with like a, I don't know, 20 line poem ish, something like that. And they're beautifully done. So that's people can read those and enjoy those. So if you have to, I hate asking because I know I would hate answering this question. What's your favorite poet? But what poet do you like? Who do you gravitate to most? Like who if you see their name on the top of a poem, you're like, yes, I get to read this person again.
Oh yeah, there's so many. I would say I really love Mary Oliver.
Okay.
I go to Mary Oliver quite often. I like Ada Limon. I love her stuff. I really love Naomi Shihab Nye.
Okay.
She's one of my favorites. And what I'm reading right now, I'm reading Christian Wyman,
Okay.
and so he's just beautiful writing. So those are some things those I see those names and I'm
Yeah.
like, yes, I'm gonna read that.
I like it. Yeah, yeah. I was way behind the curve. I did not get a great like undergraduate education nor a good high school education. I never read T.S. Eliot, and I finally went through his four quartets, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is different writing than I've ever experienced in my entire life before this. So it's gave me an
That's so
appreciation for poetry, for sure. So first substantive question. People are like, get on with the book. So we'll get on with the book. So what's the background behind this book beyond ethnic loneliness and the desire to write it? And then attached to that, can you define what you mean after you talk about the background by ethnic loneliness?
Mhm. Sure. So when was thinking about this book and writing this book, this idea that was coming to me, it was based on my own life experience. And my own life experience, even though I couldn't have defined it at the time, but what I was going through. And I would say over the past 10 years, I experienced a greater transformation and a realization of of some of the things I had gone through that I hadn't actually named,
Hmm,
but were part of my experience. And that when I talk about my experience, I mean my experience in appreciating and naming my ethnic identity. So that's kind of the background of where this started. And the other piece of it was that, we talked earlier about the public health background.
hmm,
So I was looking at this from a public health lens also,
hmm, hmm.
because the Surgeon General a few years ago declared loneliness as an epidemic.
Yep.
And so we have this epidemic of loneliness in our society already. We are isolated, we are disconnected more and more from each other. And I was thinking about that also in terms of ethnic minority groups. And what does that mean for an ethnic minority? Like, what are the other layers that we can unpack and talk about when it comes to loneliness and belonging to a minority group?
Hmm. Yeah. It was I don't know if it's a funny joke, but it was a joke 2 years ago. So we were talking before recording. I live in Santa Ana, which if anybody knows the Orange County, California area, it's like kind of known mockingly, but more jokingly, and it's by residents. It's like the Little Mexico because it's 92% Hispanic.
Mm,
And it was a one place, and my wife's Hispanic, her whole family is obviously Hispanic. It was a one place where her uncle joked, like I actually added the diversity when I walked into Santa Ana for the first time, which now it's like reading your book, it's like I know generally white people are not the minority, but it was like the only place where I was like, I kind of feel a little bit in a tiniest little smidge what it's
mm,
like to be the only white person in the midst of a lot of Mexicans.
mhm,
Even though it's not the same thing, of course I know, but it was a little bit of a little bit of a taste to see like, oh yeah, every grocery store I walk into, I'm about the only white person.
mm,
Everywhere I walk on the streets, I'm pretty much the only white person. There's a few places where it's not true, but it is something you don't notice until you notice. And it's like, huh, this is. this is different. So this is it's a helpful book,
Yeah.
not just for me, but I'm assuming for a lot of people who listen to this too. So let's get into some of the specifics. What are some of the ways, both done intentionally and unintentionally? So people who are doing this maybe not out of malice, and some who are like a little bit more pointed, that cause those who are of the minority group, whatever that may be, in majority spaces to feel culturally distanced or lonely and unwelcome.
Hmm. That's a good question. So I think so you asked like unintentional and intentional, and
Yeah,
I'm
those who are like not trying to be distancing, but
yeah.
kind of are by the questions and the things that they say, or and those who are trying to be distancing and unkind.
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to unintentional, I think I'll start with that one.
Yeah,
So unintentional, I think there's something that we all have, and it's called unconscious bias.
sure.
And unconscious bias just means that there are parts of us that we might be feeling certain attitudes or prejudices or sentiments that we're just not necessarily aware of.
Yeah,
And it's inherent in the name unconscious bias. We're just not conscious of it.
yeah.
And actually we all have it.
Hmm.
We all have some of this,
And it
even
could
though
be good or it could be bad. It could be like good biases and bad biases.
yeah, exactly. It could be good or bad. And so we're all walking around with it. We
Yeah,
just aren't aware of it. And we need some external help to help us name and point what those are, the positive and the negative. So that's, I think, one of the unintentional things that
sure.
happens in our society is we're not necessarily aware that we are having these feelings or attitudes, but we have them and we all have them.
Yeah,
So and then there's, of course, the intentional and,
yeah,
like and we can and I think we all know what some of those are, but I think we can also kind of define them also based on, um, for example, societal or structural, systemic sort of things that are
yeah.
intentional, like policies, for
Hmm.
example. We can take a policy such as redlining, which happened, in the earlier part
Which
of the
is
20th
why
century.
CNN, funny enough, sorry to cut you off, but it's why CNN exists in the first place. It's because of redlining.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, the perfect example right there. So what has happened is segregation right there in Santa Ana because of redlining.
Hmm.
And it is because of those policies that was intentional. It was intentional because the redlining policy
Yep.
and using that
Because
as an
all the
example,
wealthy cities kind of border us, and then we're like the quote unquote unwealthy city right in the middle.
right? So, and so that was intentional. It
It
was
was. Yep.
intentional to exclude certain groups from housing
Hmm.
and living in certain areas. And so you were living right in the middle of it,
Hmm.
right there. We're living
Yep.
in the middle of an intentional policy.
Yep.
So, and then, but I think there's other layers too. I mean, there's, we can look at our environments, our local communities, our local subcultures too, and kind of identify, okay, there's some intentional things and there's some unintentional things that are happening at these various layers.
Yeah. So let me ask you, and this is not on the original questions that I asked you because it was kind of a sub question for this one. But when people ask you, because you're walking around Alabama, and my assumption is you don't look like most of the people who are walking around in Alabama, nor the city that you walked in, and they walk up to you and they're curious, it's like, oh, she's probably not from here. And they ask you, hey, Presenta, where are you from?
Hmm.
What's that?
Yeah. So, again, I think that question, and so where are you from? There are ways of asking that which are people are genuinely
Yeah,
curious
absolutely. Yep.
and want to know you. And then there's people who are asking, maybe they're just like, you're not from around here.
Yeah. And you say,
So,
oh, I'm from wherever,
yeah.
Alabama. I'm
And
from Wisconsin. Then they ask you, well, where are you
really,
really from?
where are you really from? Yeah. So when people would ask me in Alabama, I'd say I'm from Alabama.
Yeah.
Because that was the
Yeah.
truth. That was my home.
Yep.
And then people will say, "No, where are you really from?" Or they'll say, "Well, where are your parents from?"
Hmm.
'Cause
Hmm.
they're trying to like figure out who you are
Yep.
and trying to put like some name or label, I don't know, label or something, trying to understand who you are. So yeah, I get asked that question still even.
Hmm.
Um Probably not as much as I used to,
Sure.
but still.
Yep, yep. So, yeah, we talked about this pre-recording, and this is this is an issue, and you don't spend a ton of time in the book, but you do. There are some points in the book that you highlight this, where the evangelical church as a whole, more or less, depending on where you're at, but I mean, in general, is more or less dominantly white, and the culture that I inhabit and have my being, the Reformed culture, is almost entirely white, at least in America. If you go outside of America, if you go to Brazil or Nigeria, it's of course not obviously white. So focusing more on church culture, can you talk about your experience? There's a lot of statistics and experience of those who dwell in majority white spaces and how they might feel either isolated or marginalized and othered, and maybe more particularly so in the church.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think one thing I think that is important to remember is people of color, when they're entering in a white space, whether it's a church or some other space, they're first of all, they're all very different. There's
Hmm.
so many the wide range of ethnic minorities, each with a different experience, background, culture, language, religion. So they're all very unique. And so I think that's one thing to remember is that every one of them is coming in with that a unique perspective
Yeah.
and a unique background. But the other thing I want to mention is that they're bringing their own experiences of being an ethnic minority. So when they're coming into church, that person is coming in with that whole background with them. They're carrying their culture, and they're also carrying whatever trauma they may have experienced, being a minority. They're bringing that with them into that church space. For example,
Hmm.
you specifically mentioned church. So so when they're coming into that space, they're bringing those feelings of being othered, perhaps. Um, there is this feeling of what I call, well, it's not a term that I have
Sure.
coined, but it's called a perpetual foreigner. So showing up into spaces where you are always consistently the minority, you tend to feel like you are constantly the foreigner, and you are trying to figure out how to navigate that space. You're trying to think about, what parts of me are allowed here,
Mm.
what parts of me are not allowed here, and how can I be myself? So I think that people of color balance that whole question of um, how much do they show up as themselves and how much do they not, and risk, how much are they risking to do that? And so when you're showing up in a place of worship, if you are in a congregation of one whole ethnic group and then another person walks in, so that person is also coming in with their own cultural ideas about worship.
Yeah.
And how can we, for example, I can give you an example,
Yeah.
like Asian Americans, for example,
Hmm.
the wide variety of religions that Asian Americans come from. There's Hinduism,
Hmm.
Buddhism, there's Islam, and each of these worship differently. And so, for example, in India, Asian Indians, the way they worship, it's more of a part of their lifestyle and how they live, as opposed to we go to church every Sunday and this is how the service is organized. Like in our US culture, we have a certain way of worship and going to church. But in other countries, it's not like that. It's a
Yeah.
little different. And it could be different per person and per family. And so they're coming in with different ideas about what worship looks like. And and so this is true for immigrants, but it's also true, when my book is ethnic loneliness, and in one of the first chapters, I spend some time defining terms.
Hmm.
Like, what do I mean by Black? What do I mean by
Hmm.
Asian? What do I mean by Latino? So it's a different also for the Black population. What does it mean for them to show up in church? That means something different than a Latino person or an Asian person.
Yeah. So and sometimes I try to channel what I assume because we get questions after publishing the interview or from friends or honestly from myself. I can imagine someone saying, well, this is how we've always, whether it be the church, whether it be even business, whatever it may be. I can imagine someone saying, this is how we've always done it. This is just how it's done. And when they see something else or hear something else, like what you're saying, they was like, well, that's just not how it gets done. That's just not how we do it. This is how it's always been done. This is just how church goes. This is how this business runs. This is how this family runs. What might you say from a perspective that may not share that to say, this is how we can engage in some of those conversations?
Mhm. That is a very common response, right? This is how we've always done it. Why should we change? It's working, right? Is it working though? That's the question we can ask ourselves. Yeah, one of the things I think that I believe that we need is curiosity.
Hmm.
So curiosity and asking questions and asking ourselves, is it about the way that we've done things, or is it how does that person feel? Like let's be curious and ask some questions. We're assuming that because this is the way we've always done it, it's working. But are we asking the question and asking that
Yeah.
person, is this really working for you?
Or this is the way of doing it. This is where everybody else does it. So of course, why would everybody else not do it this way?
Yeah. Right. So, is it the only way? Like, there are so many ways to,
Yeah. Yep.
worship, as we know. So, I think part of it is just, being curious and having some cultural, maybe awareness or sensitivity to just thinking about, these questions and asking these questions, in our spaces and asking ourselves, how would I feel? Like
Yep.
Peter, have had that experience living in Santa Ana. So you have
Tiny
an
experience, yeah, but experience
right,
nonetheless.
you have a little bit of that experience, but you are aware, right? I
Yeah.
think you are aware that this could be an issue for other people.
Hmm.
So I think developing that sense of awareness, and how do we do that?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we can do is challenge ourselves into going into spaces that where we are um, different.
Hmm.
So for one example that I can share
Hmm.
is when I was in college, actually it was in graduate school, one of our teachers challenged us to do this. We were challenged as an assignment to choose an environment that we had never been to, and that we would be the only person like us. We would be like, we don't know what's going on.
Hmm.
And so I ended up choosing to go to a Jewish synagogue.
Hmm.
I had never been to a Jewish synagogue. Now imagine me in the Midwest going to a Jewish synagogue. I I I stood out.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yep.
No mistaking who was visiting that day.
Sure.
And interestingly, when I called and I was trying to figure out when do I show up in the services, and I listened to the message, and I just heard words. I didn't understand what I was hearing.
Yeah.
I wrote down some times, and I
Sure.
said, "I'm just gonna show up." I ended up showing up at a bat mitzvah, and
Huh.
no idea I had no idea that's what was
Yeah.
happening. But, it was super interesting because an elderly Jewish lady sat next to me, and she looked at me, and I said, "Is it obvious that I don't are people wondering why I'm here?" And
Yeah.
she said, "Oh, they probably think you're a Yemeni Jew." I said, "Oh,
Huh.
okay." Okay. Nobody, like, asked me to leave or anything, but
Yeah.
I did see people looking my way, and maybe they thought I was a friend of the Jewish lady that was sitting next to me, so it kinda worked in my favor, but,
Yeah,
um
that's right. I like that. I like that example. And this again, this is not this will lead kind of into the next question, but as a bridge, and this might sound like an obvious question on the front end, but I want to ask this for our listeners and for those who might have the same experience as you, and for those who may not have the same experience as you. What's it like as an ethnic minority walking into a space that doesn't look like you, that doesn't sound like you, that doesn't do things like what is it, for lack of a better way of asking this, what's it feel like walking into some of those spaces?
Mhm. So I can speak for myself,
Yeah,
and I think if you ask other people, they'll also share how they feel. Um,
absolutely.
the way that I feel, and what one of the ways that I talk about is this feeling of showing up fractured.
Hmm.
So you're showing up not as your full and whole self. You're wondering whether you will be accepted, and you're wondering how much people are looking at you. there's always, so here's the thing, when I walk into a room, and I've talked to other people of color who
Hmm.
say this, when I walk into a room, one of the first things I am noticing is there any other person of color in this room?
That's exactly what my wife thinks.
Exactly
100%.
counting.
Yep.
I'm counting, I'm looking, and I'm gauging whether I'm the only one and how many of us are there
Yeah.
and where they are,
And
right?
it's not a question, to be honest, that I ask myself all that often, but it is a question my wife asks herself a lot.
Exactly, and we are constantly asking
Mm,
ourselves that. We are constantly aware. We are aware of that. Whereas I guess white folks, they don't have that feeling of
sure.
like you said, you don't have to ask yourself that question.
No.
But we're asking ourselves, like, how many of us are in this room?
Mm,
That's one of the first things I think about. And then I have to think about there's this whole mental thing going on in your head,
yeah.
and you're not even always aware of it because it's so like common and automatic now.
Yeah.
You're thinking, okay, like how much do I, what do I say? How do I
Yeah.
show up? I've even thought like, um, sometimes if I'm in a new place and I have to put my name tag on, do I use my real name? I used to wonder, should I use my real name?
Hmm.
Should I use an American nickname to make it easier for everyone else?
Hmm.
So
Yep.
those are questions you don't like, Peter.
Yeah. I've
Maybe
never thought
you
about that from Peter. Yeah.
ever change your name, Peter?
No, no.
To be
I've
Bob
only
or
ever heard it
Daniel.
mispronounced once, which is beyond me. But yeah, I've never thought of doing that.
Never had to change your name, right?
No.
So those are some things that I guess are unique, and it's like feeling in limbo, right?
Mm,
We're kind of like we're navigating, we're there's like this not quite feeling of being fully settled, and we're wondering, we're wondering
yeah.
what's going to happen,
Yeah. Yeah.
and what what might someone say to me, right? Um, what is the state of belonging going to be?
Hmm,
Like, that's the deeper question. What
hmm,
is the state of belonging going to be for me here in this space?
hmm. Yeah. That's good. That's the reason why I asked that. I was hoping you were, I was assuming you're going to say, because I read your book. So I was assuming you're going to say something close to that, which is a perfect bridge into this next question. You talk about, you can maybe define what you just said as like you're an exile. It's you don't quite fit into a specific people group that you're walking into. And I think in your case too, with your background, it's both ethnically and religiously. So it's often feeling unwelcome, and other as the only or one of the few brown people in places you inhabit in America, and also being too cultured. And you talk about this in your book, which I had never thought about until I read this, that you're like too American when you walk around and you visit in India. And so, can you talk a little bit what it's like to like I'm Indian, but I don't quite fit in India. An American, I don't quite fit in America. What's that like to feel like you don't really belong in either place?
Yeah, yeah, I grew up feeling like, like mismatched. So one of the stories I like to share is when I was a little kid, I used to play this matching game where you had these cards and they would be turned face down and you would have to flip the cards over and match the cards.
Hmm.
And I always felt like I mismatched. Like
Hmm.
I don't fit here because people in America look at me and they don't know if I can speak English. They don't know sometimes what I am or who
Sure.
I am. They may not want to start a conversation with me because they don't know.
Yeah.
And in India, for sure, I don't fit in because I don't speak the language.
Huh.
And I would go there and I would not fit in at all culturally because I wouldn't know. I don't know what the cultures are, what the practices are, how to behave. Um, so my mom, I want to share a story. Like
Yeah. Do it, please.
um, we went to India 2 years ago. I went with my parents and my brother's family after many, many years for all of us to go together. And even for my parents, it had been, I want to say 17 years,
Dang.
and which is a really long time
I imagine. Yeah.
to go without seeing their family. So we went together and we were in New Delhi, and my mother, she had never been to the Taj Mahal. So she wanted to see the Taj Mahal. So
Gotta
we
see
made
it. Yep.
plans to go, and we were there getting our tickets. And so the ticket guy said, "Well, are you Indian?" And we said, "Yes, we're Indian." And said, "Show us your passports." And so we
Ah.
pulled out passports, and they're American passports. And he said, "Nope, you're not Indian. You have to pay the tourist prices." So we had to pay the tourist prices. And my mom, it was interesting. She said to me, "Huh, we're like foreigners, and I'm a foreigner in my own country."
Yeah.
That's what she said, and she said, "And even in the US, I'm also kind of a foreigner." So it was just this super interesting um, interaction and response because, yeah, you don't think about that. And
No.
so you're in this liminal space. And I think too, like, I think when I was growing up in the South, there was nobody else like me, like no other Indian American like me. There are now,
Mm-hmm.
because my parents were among the first wave of immigrants from Asia,
Hmm.
especially India, that came in 1965. The United States
Yep.
passed the Immigration Act,
Yep.
and so my parents were in that first wave of people that
Same thing
came.
happened in Orange County in the 70s, specifically in Irvine, which is like I hate using the stereotype, but it's like it's true in Irvine. It's very tech heavy, and so
Mhm.
they got a lot of tech immigration in the 70s from India
Yeah, in
specifically.
particular.
Yeah.
So you saw that happening in Irvine.
Yeah.
Well, not many people were flocking to rural Alabama.
No.
We were,
Yeah.
I don't know what drew us there, but
Yeah.
we ended up there, and beautiful weather, beautiful state, so green and pretty, but no other Indian people. So yeah. So that was also part of it, is where you
Yeah.
grow up, in Irvine, it would have been different.
Yeah.
I would have had pals like me, but
That's
not
right. Yeah.
not in rural India, not in rural Alabama.
Totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have a this is going to be sort of an off the wall question, and I hope it's not intrusive at all. But when you start talking to somebody, does anybody like expect an accent and like, oh, you quote unquote speak normal?
Well, I can tell you this, that's happened before because I have had people say to me, "Wow, you speak really good English."
Yeah,
And
like you don't
so
speak like
I'm like,
Indian accent, and there's no Southern accent from what people can hear. I'm just curious if people are like, oh, when you open your mouth, I was like, oh, that's not what I was expecting.
well, I will tell you this really funny story again. I have a good story for you.
Yeah, I love this. Yep.
I growing up in Alabama, I actually had a Southern accent. It was
Ah,
not strong, but it
yep.
was most definitely a Southern accent.
Was this intentional or just like kind of seeped into you?
No, it just kind of like I absorbed it, just
Okay.
being there, growing
Yeah.
up and going to school there. And so when I moved to the Midwest and in my 20s and I started opening my mouth and I started talking, people would start laughing. They would just laugh at me. And I actually make that joke in the book. I say, if it was that easy to make people laugh, I would have been a
Yeah.
comedian because it was
That's
that
right.
easy
Yep.
to make people laugh.
Yep.
Open my
Yep.
mouth. You're not expecting an Indian girl to speak Southern. So,
No. Yeah.
and so it just kind of flew, like, people were not like, they were just like, "What? What?" So, that was something really funny that happened to me. And boy, did I actually try to get rid of that accent fast.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And this is a completely random question. And this is have you ever heard of the podcast Armchair Expert?
I have not.
Okay, with Dax Shepard and Monica Padman. Monica Padman is an Indian American. She lived in Alabama, and her story is remarkably similar to yours. And I was listening to their show today, and she talked about her exile status from being I don't she was born in Georgia. But she's talked about like I was born in Georgia, but my parents were born in India, and then when I was in here, nobody accepted me. And I feel like you would like listen to her and listen to that show too. Just you guys share a lot of similar background stuff. That's just
Yeah, I made a note of that. I'm gonna take a listen. Sounds
cool.
good.
So um, next questions. Having friends who don't share your same skin color, your ethnicity, your cultural backgrounds. We've talked about some of the stuff that can be bad about it or that can be uncomfortable and lonely, but it can
Mhm.
also be a tremendous education in itself. We've kind of touched this topic, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. What both because they can point out cultural blind spots that you might never have noticed before, and they live that exilic life, which is, to be honest, about as pinpointy scriptural as you can get for who we are as Christians in general. So, can you talk about some of this stuff?
Sure. So, yeah, I think one thing you just said was they can point out blind spots in us. We talked earlier about unconscious bias, but having friends of so many, I think it just almost goes without saying, I feel like, but having a diverse group of friends is so enriching.
Yeah,
You learn different perspectives, and it's such a rich learning experience on so many levels. Creativity, synergy. And honestly, when we talk about a minority, we have to also mention that by 2045, the US is going to be a non-white majority.
Yep.
So it means that we're shifting demographically. So but it doesn't mean that, all of our issues are going to go away.
No.
It's not going to change automatically, but we're going to be seeing more and more of this. I think we're going to have more and more of these conversations,
Yeah.
and be willing to kind of bridge the ethnic and cultural gaps by reaching out to our neighbors who are from different countries and backgrounds and different races and ethnicities than us. So I think our world is going to have to move that way because we're shifting.
Yeah.
And so in order to understand each other, we have to spend time with each other and talk to each other,
Yeah. And then what about the like the exile status too that you talk about? This is more towards the end of the book
Mm,
where the like you said, the liminal space that you inhabit, that I'm assuming that a lot of minorities inhabit too, which is not the same liminal space as somebody who comes from my background may inhabit. What does that teach us about what scripture says pretty plainly is that all Christians are exiles, not just the
mm.
minorities.
Yeah, and of course we all in that sense we as Christians are living in exile, living in a state of exile, and so we should have like you would that is kind of like a starting point I
Yeah.
think too to understanding exile and then what it means to be reconciled. It's not just that we live in exile, but we have also experienced reconciliation and we experience belonging from God. So how we should be the first.
Hmm.
Like, how can we extend that invitation of reconciliation and belonging to all people? Because that invitation is there for everybody. And so we have that experience. So how can we extend that to others? Um,
Yeah, that's good. So later in part two, and this is kind of summarizing part two, like the last third of the book ish. You chart a path. This is not just all that's wrong with loneliness and woe is you, America, and everybody. This is what do we do now? What do we do with this? And I don't remember if you said this or this is me summarizing it, but not ethnic. It's not just like blend all the ethnicities together and make them one. It's no, we have our distinctives, but they're like a beautiful mosaic with one another. They're distinct, but they're also let's unify around all this. Where all people you talk about this quite a bit. And I love this. This is from Revelation 7. Every tribe, tongue, people, nation come together without losing their distinctiveness of who they are. So what are some of the steps that you talk about in this book
mhm,
towards where we don't lose the distinctions between our ethnic backgrounds, ethnic identities, but we unify around who we are under Christ, or I guess in general, just as humans.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that picture is, a picture of like you said, we don't lose our identities, but we are still unified. I think I'm going to give like three steps maybe, and
Please, yeah,
this is maybe simplified, and we can talk
yeah.
in more
There's a whole
detail.
lot more. If people want more, read the book.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say like maybe one of the first things that was good for me, that was helpful for me, was healing and reclaiming. So it was for me personally because I had to go through steps of healing and reclaiming my ethnic identity. I had to go through this journey of spiritual healing too. Like this is how God made me,
Hmm.
but I was not. I wanted to be white.
Hmm.
That's what I wanted when I was young. And so I had to go through that whole experience of accepting and reclaiming and healing from all of that. And so that was number one for me was I think that there are many of us who have to kind of deal with that and address that and accept it and rejoice in it and believe it and that it's a
Hmm.
good thing,
I think at
right?
some point in the book you talk about your hair is like let's just not it doesn't move the way or it doesn't like lay the way that some of the white girls moves and like I really wanted to change that, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So those parts of our identity that everything like, that we don't like, but everything is redeemed by God. So
yeah,
it's anyway, just healing in our identity and reclaiming that. And then the other thing I would say is sharing our stories, and this is a kind of a two-way street.
Yeah.
So for the ethnic minorities to share, to talk, to share, but there is the caveat I want to share with that is that to be safe, like
Yeah.
there is a risk to speaking up, there's a cost to speaking up, there's a cost to being silent. So we as ethnic minorities are navigating that and trying to make decisions about that cost. Do we speak up or do we be silent and sharing our story? The other side of sharing our story is that we need someone to listen to the story. You know, we need places to share the story. We need platform. We need opportunity to share our stories. So that's number two. And I guess number three would be just remaining safe and soft, and not letting the world harden you,
Hmm.
but how can you be soft and remain safe but soft?
That's good. Yeah. And maybe I'm channeling, not because I'm in a minority. I'm channeling because I've heard this from my wife or from other people before. We're like, what about those who are like, I just feel kind of like the token black person in this area, or the token Mexican. Whenever anything comes up, like I'm the person they talk to about.
Mhm.
Maybe you could talk to them. It's like this is exactly towards your last point. Like the jade is like I have no other choice but to be this person here. How do I navigate this space amongst those who like I'm the person they go to for this?
Right. And that's very common. As ethnic minorities, we are constantly, so I think that we straddle being invisible and then hyper visible.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. Yep.
and so all of a sudden we're visible, and
Yep.
they want us to speak to this issue because maybe for optics,
Hmm.
for tokenism, for, and then but then when it comes to making, systemic changes or whatever, then all of a sudden it's invisibility again. So it's really tough. It's a tough place to be. And
Yeah.
we're constantly straddling and navigating that.
Yeah. I don't I don't envy that whatsoever. But it is something that yeah we have to work through together. So to conclude this, we've covered a ton of ground, and there's so much more in this book that I very much encourage people to pick this up and read this. Both if this is something that kind of matches your story, I mean, of course, pick this up. And if this is something that doesn't match your story, pick this up. And that brings me to this last. What's your hope for those who read this? Both those who are part of majority culture, like myself, and those who are minority culture who inhabit the same space, albeit like you said, with different stories, different occurrences, whatever it may be. For speak to both people again, generalization, who might pick up this book for what you hope that they get from it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll speak to, say, the minority reader
Yeah.
first. So for the minority reader, I really hope that they get a sense of celebrating who they are, and that they realize their sense of belonging and where that comes from, and that they can find that, and that they don't have to apologize, that they find that place of belonging. They don't have to apologize for who they are, and they can show up for themselves. That's my hope. And that they really experience belonging. And for both of us, like for the majority
Hmm.
reader, I hope that this book gives people a sense of what it really feels like to be in
Hmm.
another person's shoes, like trying to give language and define that experience, and at a deeper level, and also just like what can we do about it, like, um, and I guess for both groups,
Hmm.
I'll say this for both groups, because we're all lonely.
Hmm.
We
Big
all
time.
are
Yeah.
lonely.
Yeah.
And I think that loneliness is kind of like, that quote by C.S. Lewis about pain is like
Uh-huh.
a megaphone, right? I think loneliness is a megaphone, and it's screaming right now in our culture. And I hope that loneliness is that megaphone sound coming through, telling us that we need to go back to each other, that we belong, to each other, and we need each other, we need community,
Mhm,
and that living fractured in the ways that we are is not healthy, it's not working, it's not right,
mhm.
and that, we can find ways to get back to each other.
Yeah, and maybe too, if I can talk to people who look like me and think like me. Whenever like I either I've said it or Presenta said it too. It's when cultural blind spots are pointed out. It's not always or necessarily just for like, oh, this is horrible. Why do you do this stuff? It's just you don't notice it until you notice it, whether it's good or bad, whether it's kind of a bad blind spot or like, oh, this is just different than what everybody else does. Because that's something I fear that kind of majority culture thinks. It's when these kind of conversations come up, it's always like the worst aspects of the culture are pointed out, and this is what's got to change. Which of course we have to do that, but that's not the entire conversation. Like you said, there's the beauty in the culture, and those are the things we want to point out too as well. Because I already know those who are listening, uh, who are part of majority white culture. I already know if they've made it this far, some are fuming. I was like, why would you even talk about some of this stuff?
Mm,
Um, that's I'm because like to be honest, like I feel it myself at points where it's like, oh,
mhm,
this is hard. This is not something you want to talk about all the
mhm.
time. But like you said, this is it really does help. Yeah. Even though I personally will never go through some of this stuff. It really does help to read it from your eyes and to walk in your feet a little bit and others and say, how does she view the world? How does he view the world? Which doesn't say that what I see is wrong. It's just it's different, and we can talk to each other about this stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for sharing your discomfort and with that and how some viewers might respond with it. But I would like to challenge and push
Yeah.
that a little bit because if we're feeling that,
Hmm.
then I think we need to stop and examine that and
Hmm.
why. You know, there is what is the reason for that discomfort? And to examine that and go deeper and ask why. Why is this making me
Yeah.
uncomfortable? Why? And so I think that there's value in spending time examining that question and not just pushing it away and saying, I'm not going to even look at that. I'm not going to listen to this or think about it. Um, it's hard
Yeah.
and we don't want to do it. It's hard work.
Hmm.
Uh, but you know what? And I will say this, you know, we all are doing different kinds of hard work, but
100%.
the ethnic minority person around you is doing that hard work
Oh yeah, all the time.
without you thinking about it.
Yep. Yep.
So you have the privilege of saying, "I'm not gonna think about this."
Yep.
But they don't. They don't have that privilege. They have to think about it. So,
Mm.
so anyway, I think I just yeah, I just wanna encourage people to just press in a little bit and not run away from that and see what God might be wanting to say
I like it.
about that.
Cool. Yeah, that's good, and that's a good note to end on. Well, thank you, Presenta, so much for making the time, for coming on, for writing this book, for people to read, to learn, to like you said, think critically and talk to others and invite more into this discussion for those who either may not share the same experiences, for those who do share the same experiences, what all of our shared experiences are that unify this. Thank you so much for coming on the show, for writing the book, and I hope people pick up this book.
Peter, thank you so much for having me. It was, delightful to be here with you. Thank you for your kind words about the book. I really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah, I like well written books, and this is a well written book. This is I very much encourage people to pick this up.
Thank you so much.